Hey, AP students, ready for a cram session on the carbon and nitrogen cycles?
You bet. We're going to break them down so you can ace that AP exam.
Awesome. Let's jump right in with the carbon cycle. I know carbon is like everywhere, right? Like it's the backbone of life.
Totally. Carbon's constantly moving between the atmosphere, oceans, rocks, soil, you name it. Think of it as like this giant game of hot potato, but on a planetary scale.
So how does carbon actually move between all these places? I know plants play a big role with, photosynthesis.
Oh, yeah, photosynthesis is key. Plants and algae are like little carbon capturing machines. They use sunlight to turn carbon dioxide and water into sugar and release oxygen as a byproduct. Pretty sweet deal, right?
It's like plants are doing us a huge favor.
Totally. They're running the first leg of this carbon relay race, you could say.
So what happens to the carbon they capture? Does it just stay in the plant forever?
Nope, carbon's always on the move. When we breathe, we release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere.
Oh, right. Respiration.
Exactly. And when anything dies and decomposes, the carbon from their bodies also returns to the environment.
So carbon's being taken up and released all the time. It's like a constant flow.
You got it. For a long time, things were pretty balanced. Scientists call it a steady state, like a perfectly choreographed dance.
But then humans decided to join the dance floor, right?
And let's just say we haven't exactly been graceful.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, think about all the fossil fuels we burn. Coal, oil, natural gas, all that. They're like ancient carbon stores.
Hmm.
And when we burn them, we're basically unearthing all that carbon and releasing it as carbon dioxide.
So it's more like a mosh pit than a waltz at this point.
Pretty much. All that extra carbon dioxide messes up the balance, leading to a buildup of greenhouse gases.
And that's where global warming comes in, right? The more carbon dioxide, the hotter things get.
Exactly. Now, are you ready to tackle the nitrogen cycle?
Okay, nitrogen. That one's always felt a bit tougher for me.
It might seem tricky, but remember, nitrogen's just as important as carbon. It's like a key ingredient for proteins and, well, DNA, all the stuff that makes you, you.
Okay, so why isn't nitrogen just readily available if it's so important? I mean, the atmosphere is, what, like 78% nitrogen?
Right. But here's the catch. It's in a form that plants and animals can't use directly. Imagine having a treasure chest full of gold, but no key to open it.
So how do we unlock the nitrogen treasure chest?
That's where bacteria come in. They're like the master locksmiths of the nitrogen cycle. They can convert that unusable nitrogen into forms that plants can actually absorb.
Bacteria are amazing, so they're like running a specialized nitrogen conversion service.
Basically, it's a multi-step process, and each step involves different types of bacteria. First up is nitrogen fixation. Certain bacteria, usually in the soil or on plant roots, take nitrogen gas and turn it into ammonia.
Okay, so that's step one. Nitrogen fixation. What happens next?
Well, after nitrogen fixation, it's time for nitrification. Think of it like a two-part process.
Okay, two parts.
First, one type of bacteria converts ammonia into nitrites, and then another type swoops in and turns those nitrites into nitrates.
So it's like a nitrogen assembly line. Different bacteria for each step. But why so many different forms of nitrogen? What's the big deal about nitrates?
Nitrates are the key. Plants can easily absorb them through their roots. It's like they're finally getting the nitrogen meal they've been waiting for.
Oh, I get it. And then when we eat plants, or animals that have eaten plants, we get that nitrogen too, the circle of life. I think this step is called assimilation, right?
Right on. But the cycle doesn't stop there. It's a cycle, remember? So what happens to all that nitrogen when things, well, die?
Well, I know from composting that stuff breaks down and ends up back in the soil. So does the nitrogen go there too?
You got it. When organisms die and decompose, fungi and bacteria get busy breaking things down, and they release nitrogen back into the soil as ammonia. We call that ammonification.
So nitrogen takes a little trip through the soil before going back to the atmosphere. How does it make that last journey back?
That's where denitrification comes in. Certain bacteria, the kind that live in places without much oxygen, like deep soil or wetlands, convert nitrates back into nitrogen gas, which goes back into the atmosphere. Boom, cycle complete.
Wow, that's a lot of steps. It's amazing how bacteria are basically running the whole nitrogen cycle. But even with all your explanations, I might forget the order. Any way to make it easier to remember?
Absolutely. Remember that mnemonic I mentioned earlier? Get ready. It's fix, nay, ampan.
Fix, nay, ampan. Okay, that's
Yeah.
definitely unique. But how does it help me remember the nitrogen cycle?
Easy. Each part matches a step. Fix is for nitrogen fixation, where bacteria turn nitrogen gas into ammonia. AAD is for nitrification and assimilation combined, the steps where nitrogen is converted into those forms plants can use and then absorbed into their tissues, and us when we eat them.
Okay, ekitase NAA.
AN stands for ammonification, decomposition releasing nitrogen back into the soil as ammonia. And finally, PAN is denitrification, bacteria sending nitrogen back to the atmosphere.
Wow. Fix, next, and pan. That's actually pretty genius. I think that's going to stick with me.
Glad to hear it. Now, let's not forget about us humans and our, shall we say, impact on the nitrogen
Oh
cycle.
yeah, I have a feeling we're not exactly innocent bystanders here.
You're right on the money. Think about it. Nitrogen is key for proteins and DNA, and plants need it to grow.
Right, right.
Well, humans have figured out how to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, like plant supplements, to help grow more crops.
Makes sense. More food for everyone.
Sure, but it's not quite that simple. These fertilizers have helped boost food production, but they've also had some side effects. You know that delicate balance we talked about? Too much nitrogen can actually be a bad thing.
So, like, we're giving plants this giant nitrogen feast, but they can't eat it all. What happens to the leftovers?
It doesn't just disappear, unfortunately. One problem is leaching. When that extra nitrogen from fertilizers isn't absorbed, it can dissolve in rainwater and seep into groundwater.
And groundwater is our drinking water in a lot of places, right?
Yeah.
That's not good.
Not good at all. Contaminating drinking water with nitrogen is a big health concern. But that's not all. Excess nitrogen can also run off into rivers, lakes, oceans, causing all sorts of trouble.
Like what kind of trouble?
Well, remember those algae that capture carbon dioxide? They love nitrogen too, and when there's too much nitrogen in the water, they have a feast and multiply like crazy.
Algal blooms. I've heard those can be really bad, turning the water all green and murky.
Exactly, and that's just the start. When all those algae die and decompose, they use up a ton of oxygen in the water.
Creating those dead zones where nothing can
Yeah.
survive.
It's like a chain reaction. Excess nitrogen, then algal blooms, then no oxygen, then dead zones. So yeah, fertilizers are adding too much nitrogen. But are there other things we humans are doing that mess with the nitrogen cycle?
Oh, absolutely. Industrial agriculture is a big one. Think about all those huge farms raising animals for meat and dairy. All those animals produce a lot of manure, and you know what manure is full of.
Nitrogen, right. Ideally, it would be used as fertilizer in a responsible way. But when it's not managed properly, it can leach into water just like those fertilizers, contributing to, you guessed it, more algal blooms and dead zones.
So it's not just what we put on our fields, but also how we handle animal waste. It seems like everything we do affects these cycles in some way.
It really does. It all comes back to that interconnectedness we talked about.
Okay, so we've got deforestation messing up the carbon cycle,
Right.
and now we've got industrial agriculture and fertilizers messing up the nitrogen cycle. Anything else we should know about how humans are impacting these cycles?
Definitely. Think about wastewater, or rather, the lack of proper wastewater treatment in many parts of the world. All the nitrogen-rich stuff we flush down the toilet. If it's not treated properly, it can contaminate water and, the drill, contribute to algal blooms.
Wow, it's not just what we put on our fields, but also how we deal with our own waste. Every human activity seems to have some kind of environmental impact. It's kind of mind-blowing how connected everything is.
Right. That's a key takeaway here. Our actions have consequences, and understanding these cycles helps us see the bigger picture. How what we do affects the air, the water, everything.
This has been really eye-opening. But I have to admit, it's also a bit overwhelming to realize just how much we're altering these essential cycles. It feels like almost everything we do has a negative impact.
It can feel that way, I know. But the important thing is that we can make changes. We're not just sitting here watching it happen. We can choose sustainable practices, push for policies that protect the environment, even make small changes in our own lives. Every little bit helps.
That's a good point. It's easy to get discouraged, but we have to focus on solutions. So what are some things we can actually do to minimize our impact on these cycles?
Lots of things. For carbon, switching to renewable energy like solar and wind is huge. And reducing our energy consumption overall, protecting forests, those natural carbon sinks, is super important too.
What about for the nitrogen cycle? How can we reduce the harm?
Well, there's sustainable agriculture. Things like crop rotation and cover cropping help reduce the need for those fertilizers, and better livestock management to minimize manure runoff. Plus, investing in better wastewater treatment to prevent nitrogen pollution.
This is all great information. I'm starting to get a much clearer picture of how these cycles work, how our actions affect them, and what we can do to fix things. It's not just about memorizing facts for the exam anymore. It's about understanding how these cycles shape our world.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. The more we understand, the better choices we can make. We can become advocates for a healthier planet.
Okay, APE's warriors.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground on the carbon and nitrogen cycles. Let's recap the key takeaways before we move on to some final thoughts.
Sounds good. So remember, both cycles are essential for life, but human actions are messing with them. Burning fossil fuels and deforestation are messing up the carbon cycle, leading to climate change.
And all that extra nitrogen from agriculture and wastewater is causing things like eutrophication and water pollution.
Exactly. It's like we're overloading these systems, but remember, we can fix it. We can switch to renewable energy, use sustainable farming practices, manage waste better, and advocate for policies that protect the environment. It's not about giving up. It's about finding ways to live in balance with nature.
Awesome recap. And don't forget that amazing mnemonic, efficax neade anpan. It's going to be a lifesaver on that AP exam.
I know, right? Okay, before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've talked about how interconnected these cycles are, how our actions have consequences, and how we can change things for the better. But here's the big question. How can we use what we've learned to not just fix the problems we've created, but actually build a more sustainable future? How can we shift from being disruptors to becoming caretakers of these vital systems?
That's a great question. It's a challenge to think beyond just fixing things and imagine a future where we're actually working with nature, not against it.
Exactly. It's about realizing that we're part of these cycles, not separate from them. And protecting them is ultimately about protecting ourselves.
All right, so we've explored these cycles, but how is all this going to show up on the AP exam? Like, what kind of questions should we be ready for?
Well, first things first, you got to know the basics, like be able to define those key terms. Photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, the whole shebang, all those nitrogen cycle steps too, like nitrogen fixation, nitrification. You need to know what those words actually mean.
Okay, so vocab is key.
Yeah. It's like the building blocks for understanding these cycles. But the AP exam isn't just about spitting out definitions. They want to see that you can actually think about these concepts.
Right. So what kind of questions should we expect? The kind that make us really think.
Well, be prepared to analyze stuff,
Yeah.
like diagrams or scenarios showing how these cycles work in different situations. You might get a food web and have to trace how carbon or nitrogen moves through it, from plants to herbivores to the top predators.
Oh, that makes sense. So we need to see how these individual steps fit into the bigger picture.
Exactly. And they love to ask comparison questions, like comparing and contrasting the carbon and nitrogen cycles, what's similar, what's different, showing you really understand how they work and how they're connected.
Compare and contrast, classic exam strategy. What else?
Oh, human impact. You can bet there will be questions about that. The AP East exam always connects things to real-world issues.
Right, right. All that stuff we talked about, like fossil fuels, deforestation, fertilizers, industrial agriculture, wastewater. It's like all fair game for the exam,
You
right?
got it. So be ready to explain how those activities mess with the carbon and nitrogen cycles, what the consequences are, and what we can do about it. It's all about connecting the dots. Human actions, environmental impacts, and solutions.
So it's more than just knowing the facts. It's about applying them to solve real-world problems.
Exactly. That's what environmental science is all about, right? The AP East exam wants to see that you can think critically and use your knowledge to make a difference.
This is all super helpful. Any last words of wisdom for our listeners as they gear up for the exam?
Don't stress. You've put in the work. You've listened to this podcast. You're going to do great. Review your notes, practice some questions, and get a good night's sleep. And of course, don't forget that handy-dandy mnemonic.
Fix Nady Ampan. I don't think I could forget it if I tried.
It's a game changer. All right, AP Superstars, that's a wrap for our deep dive on the carbon and nitrogen cycles. We hope this episode was helpful and, maybe even a little bit fun.
Good luck at the exam. You've got this. And remember, understanding these cycles is about more than just a test. It's about becoming a more informed citizen, someone who can advocate for a healthier planet. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.